Just imagine that your husband, whom you've been married to for 3 decades now, is the most beloved pastor in the church, in the city where you live, and the guy who preaches about faith, about family, about true love 7 days a week, and who, from time to time, even posts little love letters to you on Facebook saying in front of everyone that you are the best person he has ever met in his life. But behind closed doors, that same man pressures you every week to have sex with other men, and when you resist and don't want to, he calls you frigid and blames you. When those sexual encounters with strangers don't go the way he wanted, he still demands that you sit down and write a detailed statement about your sex life for him, so he can keep it and read it whenever he wants. Totally bizarre, right? But there's more. But every time you talk about breaking up, that guy puts the barrel of a revolver under his own chin just to scare you, right? What if you insist and he actually does what he's threatening to do, right? Can you imagine that? Now, what would you do in a situation like that? Yeah, this situation is real. It actually happened. And one early morning in March 2021, the woman who went through this made a decision that changed her life and the whole city forever. But this case is much more detailed, way more complex than you might be imagining, okay? Marcos Campos, and this is the story of a family that seemed like the perfect picture until the day it stopped being one. And there are some things here that we need to investigate more closely, okay? Because there are a lot of questions for a case that seems so obvious. So let's get to the facts. Let's start at the beginning, or at least what seemed to be the beginning. The place is Ada, which is a small town with less than 20,000 inhabitants in the state of Oklahoma in the United States. A typical town where everyone knows each other and the church is the main gathering place. It's pretty much the center of the town's social life, you know? And in this town, the most beloved pastor is a man named David Charles Evans. About 50 years old at the time, the lead pastor of a Baptist church there, and he had started studying to become a pastor in 2007. Already middle-aged, he had worked his way up until he reached the top position in the congregation in 2015. His own wife described him as a charming, gentle, charismatic guy. This pastor had been married for 30 years to Christy Donnell Evans. She was also 47 years old at the time of the crime, and they had 3 children, the oldest, Brittany Long, and 2 boys. I'll explain more about them later. One of them even had a rather curious name. But just so you have an idea of how solid the couple's public image was, on March 15, 2021, a Monday afternoon, Pastor David wrote a Facebook post addressed to his wife. And it was a long, sentimental post saying that he had met Christy when they were both very young, that he had proposed to her after just a few months of dating, and that 3 decades later he was still trying to win her over every day, as if it were the first time. The pastor was super romantic. In a specific sentence of that post he wrote, and this is a really important part for you to remember, okay? That he wasn't her owner, that he didn't control her, and that she was his partner and equal in life. The congregants liked it, commented, shared it, everyone was happy. It was exactly the kind of thing you'd expect from an exemplary pastor of his age. 3 days after that post, on March 18th, David posted something else on Facebook. But this time it was a selfie taken at an orphanage in Mexico, where he had gone on a missionary trip helping migrants who were left there at the border by American patrols. He wrote in the caption of that post that he was doing his best to be the hands and feet of Jesus, showing God's love to others. He had even posed with a boy who was wearing a Star Wars t-shirt. And he took the opportunity to joke around because David was such a fan of the movie that he even named one of his own children Anakin. Remember when I mentioned an interesting story about his son? That's it. Well, the missionary trip to Mexico lasted about a week, and when he got back, he went straight to the church to do his usual routines. And that sermon, that service, ended up being remembered actually because of what happened just a few hours later, okay? And that's why I'm going to tell you all of this calmly in every detail. Look, the chosen theme was spiritual warfare. David spoke to his congregation there about doing God's work, about converting people. And then he said that if you're doing God's work, you should expect the enemy to come and try to destroy you. And no one should be shocked or start crying when the attack comes. Kind of as if he were saying that maybe, for him, the attack was coming. And if the devil wasn't attacking you, there was a reason. And if the devil was attacking you, there was also a reason. Then he left the church that Sunday, greeting all the parishioners. He went home with his wife. And a few hours later, already past midnight, he was lying there in his bed in the couple's bedroom, right? Sleeping, with no idea of what was about to happen. The emergency call happened shortly after 1 in the morning on March 22nd. It was a Monday. The voice on the other end of the line was Christy Evans, the pastor's wife. And what she told the operator was roughly the following. She had been woken up by a loud noise, a bang. She had opened her eyes then and saw her husband there, lying on the bed, bleeding, with a gurgling sound, coming from his mouth. She said she hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard anyone, but that someone had clearly broken into their house and shot her husband. Ada police arrived at the house in minutes. What the police found inside was exactly what the call had described. What the wife had said. Pastor was lying on the couple's bed, bleeding from his nose and mouth with a bullet hole in his head. Now, doctors confirmed the death there, but the house showed no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, nothing was turned over, and the pastor's wife explained that the back door was probably unlocked. She had forgotten to lock it, and that the intruder might have come in through there. The story about the break-in made sense to the investigators at that moment. The news then spread throughout Ada within a matter of hours, and the reaction was exactly what you might imagine in a small town. The whole church went into mourning. Everyone was completely shaken. The congregation gathered to pray for the family as a community. Even an official statement from the church was released. It talked about being in a state of shock, deep sadness, and asked for respect for what the family was going through. Christy, the widow, was comforted by the congregation, and the children were devastated. For all intents and purposes, at that first moment, it was the case of a good man murdered in cold blood inside his own home by an intruder, just some random stranger. The police's job now was to hunt down this intruder and find out why he did it. The police there in Ada even called in Oklahoma state authorities to help with the investigation. And these state agents, when they started interviewing the neighbors in the neighborhood, they found out that in the days before the murder, they had seen a white Mustang parked in front of the Ivins' house. A car that didn't belong to the family, a car that showed up at the family's house exactly on the days when the pastor wasn't home. That is, also during that missionary trip to Mexico that I just mentioned to you. One of the neighbors had a surveillance camera there, those that are mounted, and it managed to capture something there that confirmed, when the investigators went to check, what other neighbors had already said. So then, the investigators needed to find out who owned that Mustang, right? They cross-referenced the images they got from local businesses and found out. The name showed up in a record for that vehicle. And this man, the supposed owner of the car, was Khalil Daney Square, 26 years old. When the agents they asked Christy who this guy was. After all, the car was always there, right? Whenever the pastor wasn't around. She hesitated for a moment, but ended up admitting that this Khalil Square was her boyfriend. Check this out. Now, the simple story about the unknown intruder kind of went down the drain, didn't it? Now they had a flesh and blood suspect, a man who had spent 3 nights in the pastor's house while he was away, preaching the gospel. The investigators then started pressing Christine for more details, and that's when one of the most unexpected revelations of the case came out, because Christy began to tell how she and her boyfriend had met. And the story had nothing to do with an ordinary affair, So, according to what she told the agents, which was later even confirmed in the official case documents, okay? She and her husband David weren't your typical church couple like you might be imagining, okay? The two of them led a secret sex life. They traveled to neighboring cities, stayed in hotel rooms and such, cheap motels, and arranged sexual encounters with other men. She said that this routine had been going on for years already, and that the first time was during a trip to a resort in Texas where clothing was optional, That thing where you can be naked if you want, or not if you don't, She said she returned to the room and found her husband in bed with another man. So she said that at that moment she felt like there wasn't much she could do, like how could she say no? I didn't really understand that part very well, but like there was no way to say no. Anyway, that was the context, according to what she herself told the investigators, right? In the middle of all that, that's when she met this guy, Khalil Square. The boyfriend, lover, whatever you want to call him, went to a motel in January 2021 in one of those meetings arranged by the pastor to have a threesome. The three of them met at that motel more than once over the following months. And in one of those meetings, Christy discreetly dropped her phone number on the floor for the guy to pick up so they could start talking to each other without the pastor finding out. And from then on, according to what she admitted, the two of them really started communicating on their own without the pastor acting as a go-between. So when David traveled for that mission in Mexico around mid-March, Dave Square, the boyfriend, went to the mistress's house, and it was exactly during those 3 nights. Then, still according to the mistress's account, the two of them kind of put together the plan to kill the pastor. And here we get into the whys, the means, motives, and opportunities, so I need to give you a lot of details. Christy told the agents that she had told her boyfriend, Square, several things about David in the weeks leading up to the crime. She said her husband was controlling, that he was verbally abusive, that he called her a slut, fat, ugly, a whore. She told Square that it would be good to have more freedom. And Square, according to the court document, listened to all of this and supposedly responded with a single word in a tone that suggested he was processing it, and kind of agreed. So the plan the two of them agreed on was this. Christy was going to leave one of David's pistols along with a box of ammo right outside the house. She was also going to leave the back door unlocked. That's part of the alibi she was creating, right? So she was going to coordinate with Square on when he'd come in, and that's exactly what happened that night of the crime. Around 1 in the morning on March 22nd, Square arrived there. Christy then heard him come in, went to the dining room and saw that he was there crouched on the floor, kind of scared, kind of nervous, saying he was worried, about making too much noise and waking someone up. It was Christy actually who egged him on. She said, no, it's all good. Let's go, let's move on. She insisted on doing it immediately. Then Square went to the couple's bedroom, shot the pastor in the head while he was sleeping, and ran out the back door. Christy stayed in the living room for a moment, and then she went to the bedroom, sat there on the bed next to her husband while he was probably in agony, dying, right? She called the police, told the whole story about the intruder that I already told you guys, and man, I was just amazed. Because regardless of the reasons for someone to do that, especially this Square guy, her boyfriend, to just show up and shoot like it was nothing, man, that's really crazy, right? Well, 3 days after the crime, on March 25th, the police received a text message from Brittany Long, that is, the couple's oldest daughter. The message said the mother was going to the police to turn herself in. What had happened in the previous hours, and what would only become clearer later, is that Christy had driven to her parents' house in the city of Roland and confessed to her daughter in a face-to-face conversation there. Right? She told Brittany that she had begged Square to kill her father and that it was Square who pulled the trigger with David's own gun. Minutes after this confession then, Christy got in the car and drove by herself to the Ada police station where she repeated all of this to the state agents. And so I started thinking that maybe her daughter Brittany already knew something for her to show up like that. So she openly talked about it like it was nothing, right? Like it was no big deal. As if she already, knew something, right? Anyway, check this out. When the state agents, after she got there to turn herself in at the police station, right? When the agents started asking her why she was turning herself in after lying, in that emergency call, she said she needed to make things right with God first. Khalil Square, her boyfriend, was found and arrested the same night when she confessed everything in a nearby small town called Nuwala. Both were charged with first-degree murder. At that moment, the case obviously became national news, and the dominant narrative in all the American news outlets followed pretty much the same line. It was the story of a love triangle that ended in murder, a cheating wife and a murdered husband. Anyone want to guess the motive, huh? The two lovers agreed, but is that really all there is to it? That version seemed to make sense when certain details started to come to light. For example, the fact that David had a life insurance policy worth $250,000. And that, according to Square's lawyer, who later stated this at the trial, Christie had promised Square $160,000 from that amount, then another new pickup truck, and the two of them were going to live together after things settled down. Man, that's crazy, right? So they portrayed Christie as a calculating seductress who had used sex to manipulate a guy 20 years younger and get him to do the dirty work, get his hands dirty, right? The prosecutor on the case, a woman named Tara Portillo, would later even say that Christie played Square like a violin, right? That she was finding all the right pressure points. That she had used her sexual prowess to make the guy do anything she asked, including killing her husband. But there's always more, isn't there? A few weeks after the media coverage started, Christie's oldest daughter, Brittany, did something that completely changed the way the case was being seen, the way it was being understood. She went to NBC News and gave the network's team 4 years of private messages exchanged between her father and her mother on Facebook. Messages that went from 2017 up to a few months before the murder. And the David who appeared in those messages was absolutely nothing like the David from the public love letter he also posted on Facebook. To help you understand the size of the difference, I'll give you a concrete example, okay? In an argument that lasted for hours, in April in some previous year, the pastor called his wife frigid, used that word as an insult, and blamed her for the fact that other couples from the swinging scene didn't want to meet up with them again. He said that those other couples didn't like her, that they didn't want a second round with her. In other messages, David demanded that his wife write detailed statements about their sex life, long texts with descriptions of the things she did so he could keep them and read them later. The pastor is quite something, huh? And when she tried to resist, when she said she didn't want it anymore, he had a way of pressuring her, let's say, very particular and effective for him. He threatened to kill himself. In one of those exchanges, after one of his suicide threats, Christie wrote a short reply trying to defuse the situation at that moment. She said she would be submissive, she would be quiet, that she would be gentle, graceful, and so on. And his response to her request for peace, let's say, was to demand, in capital letters, that she give him something sexual right then. Something that she would offer on her own initiative, without him having to ask or force her. It's really crazy, isn't it? What these messages revealed and what Brittany started to talk about publicly in interviews was a pattern called coercive control. Okay, guys? This concept was developed by a late American sociologist named Ivan Stark, who even wrote an entire book about this subject in 2007. When ANBC then contacted Stark, an authority on the subject, to comment on the case, he said that it did indeed seem like a classic case of coercive control. A situation where the aggressor compares the relationship to a kind of prison, where he uses strategic and oppressive tactics to control the victim's entire environment. And Stark made an observation that helps explain why no one in the city had noticed anything. He said that this kind of relationship involves frequent physical violence, but of low intensity. And that's exactly why the victim doesn't show up, for example, at church on a random Sunday with a black eye, for instance. The marks are internal, they're financial, emotional, there's small restrictions in daily life, you know? For example, controlling what the person is going to wear, what they're going to say, who they can talk to, when they can sleep. And it even made me remember the little bird, "Get ready because we're going out." Let me know in the comments if you remembered that too. As their daughter started talking more to the press, she kept adding more details to the investigation. She said her father used a tracking app to know where the family was all the time. I mean, that's normal, but in this context, it stops being normal, right? She said he was abusive not only to the mother, but also to the children. Years later, another son of the pastor, specifically the one named Araquins, spoke directly to the cameras about what he had gone through inside that house. He said his father had a short temper, and when he lost it and his mother wasn't around, he was the one who suffered. He said that sometimes his father would get so furious that he would really hurt him, and that he even went to school with a concussion because of those beatings. In some of the versions Brittany told, the father would also bang the kids' heads together like this, you know? And there was a recurring punishment of forcing the children to spend the whole night cleaning the house. When they finished, he'd keep knocking things over to prolong the punishment. But among the episodes that came to light later, what might help the most to understand what was going on in Christie's mind in the final weeks was an incident that happened about a month before the murder. On February 14, 2021, Valentine's Day, David found out that Christie was chatting with Square, her lover, her boyfriend, and doing it secretly. They fought that day, and during the fight, Christie first said she wanted to separate and get a divorce. The next day, it was David himself who sent a message to the kids letting them know that their mother wanted to separate. Brittany, not really understanding what was going on, started calling her mother. She called repeatedly and spent hours unable to reach her. When she finally managed to get through, she noticed that her mother's voice sounded a bit different, Stiff, mechanical, she was answering in monosyllables. Everything brief, robotic, as if she was cutting her answers short, Brittany asked several times if everything was okay, and her mother said yes, everything was fine, that she shouldn't worry. The call dropped, or rather, ended, and Brittany hung up without really understanding what was going on. It was only weeks later that she found out what had happened in that room while she was talking to her mother on the phone. At that moment, David was sitting there in front of Christie, with the revolver pressed to his chin, threatening to pull the trigger, depending on what she told her daughter. It was the way, like I said, that he used to, try to keep his wife, this psychological terror, but that was becoming the last straw for Christie. And it was in this window of about 30 days between that scene with the revolver and the pastor's trip to Mexico that Christie started talking to Square about what she described in her messages as having more freedom. What I actually found strange was the fact that she followed the pastor's recommendations, right? She threatened saying, "Depending on what you say, I'll shoot and you'll have that on your conscience." Then she discussed killing him with her boyfriend. Like maybe wanting to get the guy's hands dirty, not hers, but she encouraged the guy to kill. So if he had killed alone, it would be complicated, right? So let's say that's where the chain gets tangled. And there's another detail that came to light later, which helps put into perspective the scale of what was behind that church facade, okay? During the sentencing in sworn testimony, Christie estimated that the number of men her husband had coerced her into having sex with over the 30 years of marriage was between 50 and 100. She said that in those hotels where they stayed, right? Sometimes it was one man after another on the same night. Her defense attorney, a woman named Joy Miskel, was direct in the way she described this dynamic before the judge at the trial. She said that essentially the husband was prostituting his wife and watching. She said that David demanded sex every day, sometimes several times a day, and that if Christie tried to refuse, she was raped. The defense also said that this kind of behavior had started early in the marriage and had escalated especially in the last 5 years. But this is where this story, which is already pretty complicated, right? Hard to digest, got even murkier, because the prosecution wasn't convinced by the defense's version. And the prosecutor, Tara Portillo, whom I mentioned to you, brought to court material that she used to try to show a different Christie. While Christie was in jail waiting for the trial, she wrote letters. Some of those letters were to Khalil Square, her boyfriend, and others were to another inmate she had met in prison. The letters were explicitly sexual. In one of them, she wrote that she could wear any man out in bed, and any man would have done that for her after she'd slept with him. You know what I mean, right? In another letter, she wrote a sentence that looked particularly bad in court. She said that maybe she should have paid more attention to the episodes of the show, suggesting that if she had paid attention, she wouldn't have been caught. In other words, suggesting that if she had watched more true crime shows, maybe she wouldn't have done what she did. Letters were also presented at this trial, which were used as a kind of evidence that Christie had no remorse for what she did, and that she was still the same manipulator who had orchestrated the crime. The defense countered by saying that these letters were a direct result of decades of sexual conditioning by her husband, that Christie had learned throughout her entire adult life that sex was the way to receive validation, and that this pattern wouldn't disappear overnight. Her trial happened in 2 stages. In April 2022, Christie pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter without any kind of deal with the prosecution, which means she really accepted the blame. But she left the length of the sentence up to the judge. The defense asked for a light sentence, 4 years in prison and the rest on probation. In other words, she was confident that all this background, right, of coercion and so on, and abuse, psychological and emotional abuse, that it would sway the judge. But the prosecution asked for the maximum sentence, okay? In other words, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentencing itself took place in August 2022. It lasted 2 days, and it was conducted by a judge named Stephen Kessinger. Brittany, the daughter, later, speaking in her mother's defense, said that her father abused her and her 2 siblings both emotionally and physically. And she told the judge that in her opinion, her mother had already served enough of a sentence, 30 years married to that man. David's mother, a lady named Jean Richardson, who was 80 years old at the time, later speaking for the other side, made a statement that had a big impact, okay? She said she didn't know about this alleged abuse shown in the messages, and that even if it were true, Christy had her own car, her own job, money, and a credit card. She could have simply left for another city. She could have looked for a shelter for abused women, and the choice to kill her husband was unjustifiable. Christy's father, a man named Eddie Armour, who was 78 at the time, took the opposite view, okay? And he described what his daughter had done as an escape from her own personal hell. In the end, the judge didn't really buy the story about the 4 years that the defense was asking for, but he also didn't go for the idea of life without parole. He settled on a heavier intermediate sentence, okay? Life imprisonment with the possibility of parole. In his justification, the judge said he considered it a cold-blooded crime and that although he acknowledged the history of abuse, he believed Christy's remorse was recent, that she had only started to show regret in the months leading up to the trial. According to the defense's calculations based on Oklahoma law, Christy will only be eligible to apply for parole in 2060 after serving most of a 45-year sentence. She was 49 years old when she was sentenced, which means she'll be 87 when she can make her first request. In interviews she gave before the sentencing, Brittany, the daughter, said that on the day her mother confessed at her grandparents' house before going to the police station to turn herself in, she said something to her that stuck in her mind. She said that even spending the rest of her life behind bars, she would be freer than she was when she was married to Brittany's father. As for Khalil Square, who pulled the trigger, he had a separate trial, okay? In September 2022, about a month after Christy's sentencing. He pleaded guilty without any deal with the prosecution. His defense, led by a lawyer named Tony Coleman, tried a different strategy. They argued that Square had been coerced by Christy, that he entered the house that night froze in fear and stayed crouched in the living room. Remember I told you about that? That's right. Christy arrived and said, "No, come on, let's finish this." Still, according to this defense, Square thought he was in a real romantic relationship with Christy, and that he had been manipulated by her promises, of money, of insurance money, of a life together with her. The judge didn't buy the coercion argument and sentenced the guy to life in prison. And then the church there, where this couple used to go, where the pastor was a charismatic leader, after everything settled down, released public statements acknowledging that even pastors are human and make mistakes. They asked for privacy so the congregation could process what had happened and kept operating as usual. And the house where David Evans was killed, even the bed itself was put up for sale. And the couple's 3 children ended up with their lives kind of split, divided, publicly defending their mother and the memories of what they experienced in that house. Another publicly confirming that the father was abusive. And the third, who was Guaranquim, stayed more in the middle, saying in the interviews he gave that he still supported the judge's decision, but that he still loved his parents, and that his father, despite everything, wasn't like that all the time. And NBC News guys published a long investigation that started with the Facebook messages provided by Brittany herself. Years later, she even started a public petition asking the governor of Oklahoma to commute her mother's sentence, arguing that her mother had already served 3 decades of her sentence alongside her father, as I said. And do you remember that question I asked at the beginning of the video? What would you do if you were in that situation? So if you've made it this far and paid attention to everything, maybe you already have an answer on the tip of your tongue, right? But the truth about this case is that her story doesn't fit into the 2 boxes that the audience likes to use here. She's not just a victim, she's not just a villain. This woman answered that question as a 47-year-old woman who had entered that marriage at 18, less than a week after turning that age. and who had spent 3 decades learning, in the cruelest way possible, that she had no value of her own except for what her husband decided she had. Could she have left? David's mother said yes. Her defense said no, because coercive control had convinced her that it wasn't possible. The judge said that maybe she could, and that's why she would stay in prison for basically the rest of her life, right? And Pastor David is no longer here to say anything except for the things he had already said in those messages that were made public, right? I kept thinking about that public post he made, a declaration of love and all, saying like, I'm not her owner, we live as equals and all that. I don't know, it sounded to me, based on everything that's been made public, it kind of sounded like a Freudian slip, What do you guys think? But that's it, abductees. For more true stories like these, packed with details, subscribe to the channel, because every week there are at least 3 episodes. Leave a like and a comment, tell me what you thought about the case, but if you don't want to comment about the case, just leave an emoji, that already helps me a lot. Share this with true crime fans and become a member to support these productions, okay? Thanks for keeping me company, much love from the Redhead, and see you next episode.